have to deal with this guy.
Yeah, I know.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. Excited to be here. We're going to talk today about civilian harm mitigation and wargaming. I'm Andrew Olson. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to kind of the concept here. We're going to go through the three of us, each of us coming from a little different of a perspective about how civilian harm mitigation and wargaming comes together. Feel free to ask questions as we go. We'll probably pause at the end of each section and have a conversation about that. I really look forward to getting into it. All right, let's get some slides going here. All right, wonderful. So this, like I said, we're going to talk about civilian harm mitigation and wargaming. One of our kind of first questions here you might be asking is what do we mean by civilian harm? So this goes beyond just kind of what you might think of as civilian casualties in conflicts like the death or injury of civilians, to include damage to destruction of civilian objects resulting from military operations. This also includes kind of the systems of life that are necessary to sustain human life. So this includes hospital systems, water systems, etc. The definition presented here is from the defense instruction around civilian harm mitigation that was released a couple of years ago. So then what's civilian harm mitigation and response, or CHIMR? You also sometimes hear about this as just CHM or civilian harm mitigation. We'll talk about some of the kind of variants and associated types with its protection of civilians, et cetera, in later presentations. For the purpose of this, CHIMR is a theory, a framework, and DoD policy. So the theory is how you should do it and why. A framework is the kinds of things you should do in the context of operations or commands to allow mitigation, et cetera. And then there's the policy itself. So the documents, the action plans, the instructions, et cetera, that work towards that. Civilian harm mitigation is the collective efforts of armed actors, militaries, and nations to reduce the scale and impact of harm to civilians for both direct and indirect results of their actions. And that definition was from my colleague, Larry Lewis. As I'll talk about later, a lot of the work that I'll be talking about is built out of where I come from, CNA, Center for Naval Analysis, and a lot of great folks have been working at this for years, and I've been taking that and applying it to wargaming. Important to note as we think about this kind of from a top-level definitional perspective is CHIMR doesn't mean you won't ever knowingly cause harm to civilians. Rather, I want folks to think about civilian harm mitigation as equipping the military to anticipate harm from its actions, understand the environments they're operating in, be able to plan accordingly because of that information, mitigate where possible and appropriate, and where either accidents or necessary harm occur, be able to respond effectively. I think about those as understanding, planning, responding, and learning. The slide here is some work that was done by, I mentioned my colleague Larry Lewis, about how civilian harm happens. There's a number of pathways that kind of research has demonstrated that lead to civilian harm in the context of military operations. Thinking about misrepresentation, misunderstanding that an object, a person, a group, the signature, the electronics, et cetera, looks like a legitimate military target. Associating objects incorrectly. And then there's kind of the collateral damage question. So not that you misunderstood the target you're doing, but you misunderstood what was in the area nearby. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but this is on some of the graphics and abilities later. The last thing I want to tee up as kind of a definitional question here is the idea of the civilian environment, which we'll return to over the course of this conversation. Looks like some of those slides are having some presentation problems here, but broadly, think about the civilian environment as all those factors within the operating environment, so factors where military operations are happening that are related to civilians. This includes infrastructure, resources, organizations, hospitals, rail networks, et cetera. Understanding these is really important for military operations, and I'll talk a little bit about this later for some of the work we've done to help commands better understand this. One of the pushes in recent years, particularly in the U.S. military, has been understanding, having a greater robust understanding of the civilian environment as an element of that operating environment. So not just thinking about friendly forces, your own forces, or the allies, the threats that are you may be facing, but also the environment which you're operating within. I think an important thing to understand as we think about civilian harm, or I try to emphasize, is it's not just about the moral and legal obligation to not harm civilians, but that it is beneficial to the national interest. This is particularly when I'm thinking about talking with operators who are already asked to do so much and have already a hard task in front of them. Why am I asking them to do what feels like something beyond either their obligations under international human rights law or the law of armed conflict? And I always try to link this back to the national interest of nations, right? Causing civilian harm, knowingly or unknowingly, is a strategic issue. It causes messaging problems both to your domestic and international populations, affects how folks are willing to work with you, access and basing, alliances, support. It affects the kind of victory that you can have. The kind of war you fight determines what your adversary might be willing to accept at the termination of conflicts. Most conflicts end at the negotiating table, and therefore how you have conducted this war matters for them. It also matters what we think of as operational relevancy. So not at that strategic level, the thought of nations and strategic objectives, but actual as operating forces. Knowing, hey, is there going to be a refugee column in front of your tank flow where you need to be? Do you have updated information about the environment you're operating in? How recent is that information? If you're operating in someone else's nation, have you been able to get good information about their civilian infrastructure, where folks are, what's a good target and not? There's a limited amount of munitions in a war, and hitting the right thing is always better than hitting the wrong thing. One of my colleagues has a business card that just says, break the right stuff, which I think can encapsulates this. You need to build a robust mechanism to respond to external reports. So there's oftentimes, when accidental harm occurs, the first reporting is from external organizations, whether that's news reports, local humanitarian orgs, or otherwise. Having a mechanism in place to respond to those reports, to understand and process, hey, did we cause harm we didn't know about, is really important to have in place prior to it, both for the perception of legitimacy, responding well, and also knowing, are our munitions working the way we expected? Are our operations going as we intended? And finally, when messaging, it's really important to have built out these mechanisms before conflict, to have staff and processes you can talk about, as that's really key for credibility when then talking about all the necessary precautions being taken in the conflict. Building out a robust, transparent capability can be important towards that. I'll pause here both for questions and to allow either of my compatriots to step in here to add a little bit more of this kind of high-level view of what we're talking about with civilian harm mitigation.
Hey, Andrew, that's a really great lead in. I really appreciate it. And just while we wait to see if there are other people that want to fire off some rounds, just quickly want to introduce myself. My name's Marco Grandi. I was a former Italian military officer. I spent 20 years in uniform and then about 6 years in and around NATO and the UN, and also 5 glorious years with the NGO sector, where I really got started on wargaming. Most of my war games were tabletop exercises, matrix games in support of security actors, military and law enforcement, where we played very much on these very crucial themes. And just one thing, I kind of wanted to push a little bit the limits of the confines of our discussion here. I definitely think that civilian harm mitigation is a very important topic. I personally specialize on the broader topic of protection of civilians and human security. So CHM is very much focused, as Andrew has demonstrated very well, on mitigating harm from the actions of others, whereas protection of civilians efforts, particularly as they're seen by NATO, is a little bit more encompassing to include mitigating harm from the actions of others, from own actions, but also, and perhaps equally importantly, mitigating harm from the actions of the adversary. And this has been really, really interesting. NATO has also developed all the way back in 2016 their POC policy. They then in 2018 broadened that even further to include a military framework to kind of cut out what the potential military role could be. And those macro sectors include, of course, mitigating harm, so really countering the negative physical effects of conflict, but also what their role potentially could be in supporting distribution of humanitarian aid, etc. That was captured in their supporting essential and basic needs. And then the third role, which was much more counterinsurgency focused, and that was support to developing a safe and secure environment, and very much lean towards the development side. But that military framework has been extremely useful to give military audiences a starting point as to what their role in the game potentially could be. So it really broke out those three sectors. Okay, how do you now operationalize this? And it didn't really matter if we were talking about the strategic, operational, and tactical. I personally think that these themes are critical to highlight to the military audience, how truly important this is. It can really have strategic impact on the conduct of the campaign, but also at the operational and tactical level. So that military framework was really crucial to give them at least a starting point, because as you could appreciate, I think Andrew's absolutely right. Military have a lot to do. These particular skills are not necessarily part of their common knowledge and skills. So as I'll talk to this point later, it's really important to give them something that they can start to get their head around, to start to plan the blue course of action, and then also facilitate red in flipping that framework and trying to figure where they can actually start to put pressure on the blue team. I'll stop there in case David wants to jump in, or if we have some questions.
No, I'm good for now. And yeah, when I come to my section, I'll draw out some of the various links through to what I've been doing.
I realized we had one more slide I wanted to include here before we break out into our individual sections. One is just an update on where this is, at least on the US side, in 2025. So I mentioned previously, I believe it was 2023, the Secretary of Defense at the time signed the DoD instruction. This is a kind of one of the highest level of instructions you can get within the Department of Defense. And so this remains on books as policy. There was a separate action plan in 2022 that was designed to implement some of the principles, develop organizational, institutional capacity within the military. This included officers at the various commands, the send-up of a center of excellence, the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence, amongst other institutional and organizational changes. My understanding from talking with colleagues is that's mostly OBE or no longer relevant. Many of those builds have been defunded or reassigned with the change of administration. The Civilian Protection Center of Excellence, who sponsors some of the work we'll talk about later, remains on the books, although with reduced staff. My understanding from public reporting that removal of that organization requires congressional action. As you may have been almost certainly following in the news, there's been a lot of debate about the place of civilian harm and civilian harm mitigation in U.S. operations following the recent strike on a girls' school as part of Operation Epic Fury in the last couple of months. Throw it back to Marco to break us out into our get start of our individual sections.
David, I know you've done a lot of work on particularly urban warfare, but not only. I'm really curious to now hear what your contribution is on this particular topic and how that ties in with CHM, which is pretty evident, but I know you'll give us a lot of really interesting nuggets. So over to you.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, if somebody can bring my slides up just whilst to give a quick bit of background. So yeah, I spent 10 years in uniform, but way back in the 1980s, back in the days of the Cold War. And I'm currently in the final year of a PhD in Wargaming Urban Conflict at Bath Spa University under Dr. John Curry. Most of that intervening time I spent running a small software company. We did a lot of work around virtual reality, a lot of work around conversational AI, and a good proportion of those projects were for UK Ministry of Defence. And I'll touch on some of those at the end of this presentation. So that just gives you an idea sort of my background. I've got a wiki or website where I provide links to most of the stuff that I'm doing. The QR code should take you straight there. So by all means, sort of grab a screenshot of that, and anything I talk about, you'll probably find more information away and on that website. So what I want to do is give you sort of several different perspectives that have emerged out of the work I've been doing on the PhD around the issues of civilian harm. And the first one is obviously if we want to represent civilian harm and how to mitigate it, how to reduce it within our war games, we need to have some sort of representation of civilians in the war games. So one of the things that I did as part of the project, as part of the PhD work, is I've been building up a database of urban war games. I've currently got just under 300 war games in that database. that vast majority of those are obviously hobby games, but there's a fair smattering of professional games in there as and when I've been able to get hold of information on them. And in order to do a statistically significant sample, I had to look at 150 of the 300 war games to actually have a look at their rules and work out how they represented civilians. And the headline figures are shown there. Basically, 58% of the hobby war games I looked at had no civilian representation. In comparison, something like 40 to 60% of the professional urban war games did have civilian representation. Needless to say, there's some quite obvious reasons why a hobby war game may not have civilian representation. You're meant to be having fun. You're not meant to be blowing up civilians. So as to present you with a fairly sterile battlefield is probably the best way of doing it. But beyond that headline figure, what I then tried to do is try to categorize the way in which civilians were represented within the games. And this is the sort of typology that I've ended up with. And just to sort of quickly talk you through that, on the left-hand side, you've got atmospheric. So all you've got is a sense of there are civilians around, and there is something to remind you of this isn't happening in a vacuum, and that there may be civilians who are being affected by what you're doing. And I'll give you an example of that at the end of the presentation, or towards the end. Another way is they may just be pawns. It may just be numbers on a track that says sort of number of civilians killed or something like that, or level of civilian anger at what you're doing. Moving beyond that, we then have the idea of a non-player character. So that is something where there are civilians, but they're divided into, or I've divided them into two groups. One is passive, which means they typically appear within the game. They do a particular inject and then they disappear. So anybody who's played We Are Coming Nineveh, you've got several cards in the deck there, event cards, which say that there's civilians that are causing problems to the operations. So you need to basically back off the operations for that turn. So that's what I would regard as a passive NPC. An active NPC is when you actually have a character or a block actually on the map that is representing a group of civilians. And that group of civilians is going to stay on that map until you do something about it. And they could well get in the way of combat operations. They could get in the way of supply operations. It may be that you need to sort of set up a DP camp and move them all the way to a DP camp. Once you've set up the camp, you may need to keep that supplied with logistics. So there's something that's going to be always sort of present for the rest of the game unless they get themselves to safety. Probably the most common version within professional wargaming is that of umpire control. So you actually have a cell within the umpire team that's there to actually manage the civilians and think through what the civilian responses might be. In some games, they can actually be a player asset. You often find this in games which are sort of maybe insurgency based. So you may have the insurgent player who has the ability to actually sort of control mobs or control demonstrations to add to the problems of blue forces within the game. And then moving to the right, we've then got active players. So this is where actually one of the players in the game is actually playing the civilians. And typically you can divide that into two different types. Non-combatants, who are the innocent civilians getting caught up in everything, which is quite rare, or combatants. So it may be, again, they are demonstrators who turn into an angry mob and start taking a part in the conflict. And then finally, you may have a situation where actually all the players in the game are representing civilians and nobody is representing anything else. And the most classic example of that is one that's to my side here somewhere. He says, no, I didn't put it out. Name is escaping me. I'm trying to find it. This War of Mine. That's it. This War of Mine, where you are basically all the players are in a bombed out house and they're trying to survive several days in the battle and usually die of thirst or disease or something worse. Orthogonally to all that lot, you've also got the idea of actually the whole game focus is around the civilian experience. And again, that's where this War of Mine comes in. That is purely about the civilian experience of war. It is nothing about the military experience of war. So I've certainly found that sort of representation has been useful for me in terms of thinking how I'm designing games. And I've certainly found it useful when I've been thinking about how I analyze games that I'm looking at. And if you want to know more about that, I did a presentation at Connections Oz back in 2024. And there's a link there to that and on my website. So that was looking at 150 games to just identify one factor. As part of the PhD, one of the things I needed to do was if I'm going to be modeling urban combat, if I'm going to be looking at war games around urban conflict, then what are the elements of urban conflict? And if you go into doctrine, you'll find several examples. If you look at various other publications, you'll find some examples. Everybody has their own list. So I thought it was reasonable I should have my own list too. But what I did want to do is make it evidence-based. And so what I did was I went through about a dozen comparative battle studies, typically World War II onwards, both in publications and also some in doctrine, and then built up a database of around 1,500 evidence items of where people mention particular elements of the urban conflict. It could be things like civilian harm, but it could be use of direct HE, it could be doing thunder runs, it could be hugging the enemy. But I collected about 100 different sort of elements, of which about 70 occurred in more than sort of represented more than 1% of the actual database. And that's what I've then sort of pulled through into this table. So if you like, it's a sort of a top 70 elements of urban conflict. And I've used the urban triad from US doctrine, so civilian population, civilian infrastructure, and man-made 3D structures as the way of segmenting them. And then again, segmented it by things which are sort of primary and secondary effects and challenges. And then what are the military solutions to those challenges? Often I was finding when people are discussing the characteristics of urban conflict, they're often confusing sort of things which were the issues you were having to deal with things which were the military solutions. And then the color code is basically to tell you how much any one of those items was mentioned in the literature. So obviously red is the most important, amber middle importance, yellow the less importance. And then the blue ones are the things which are sort of post-date the literature, but are emerging from sort of more recent conflicts. So this has given me a framework to look at how game mechanics implement these various items, and that's why there's a pile of games on the back behind me at the moment. So I'm just going through the task of I completed a second database of 1,400 data items this time, going through 100 urban war games and looking at all the mechanics that they had to cover the things on this chart. And I'm now busy writing that up as part of the PhD study. And obviously one of the aims of that was to identify where the gaps are and what are the things we aren't modeling particularly well or particularly frequently in our war games, but perhaps the literature says are important to urban conflict. And so we ought to be spending a bit more time on those. And again, if you go to the website, there's a working paper that I produced that describes the methodology behind this particular diagram. So sort of lifting the focus up a little bit, one of the things that I started getting into was looking at this issue of just war theory. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it in general terms. And it's this idea about, can you have a just war? And when you break down, is it a just war? Then typically it gets broken down into what's called jus ad bellum. Is it just to actually go to war in the first place? Jus in bello is the war conducted in a just way. And then jus post bellum. So is there a just peace? And I've identified there sort of some of the key features some of the key questions you might want to ask in each of those. And so one of the things that I looked at, and there's a QR code there that links you through to a book chapter that I've got. And again, I've done a Goose lecture last year on the topic. We'll say, well, okay, can wargaming actually help us with that? And obviously, you can see a lot of these are very much related to civilian harm reduction and mitigation. If you look at is it just to go to war? Well, this is where you can potentially use wargaming to explore the options. So one of the questions there is, have you explored sort of all the options to avoid war? Well, you can use wargaming to explore some of those different options. You can use it to generate an evidence base for your decisions. You can do it for sort of stress testing. And there's a use probably both for sort of matrix type games, so very free games, in order to explore sort of some of the political military and grey zone type options and consequences, and also for rigid games to look at issues of proportionality and what the chances of success might be. In the center, we've then got are we actually conducting the war in a just way? And that's where most war games start and end. One of the things I've been using in my games is what was the USECT model, which is about understand, shape, engage, consolidate, and transition, which makes you think about what is happening before and after the actual kinetic war game in the middle. And most of that has a relationship to what the civilian population is doing, understanding the civilian population before the battle, trying to mitigate harm during it, and then trying to actually recover the population and the services and the infrastructure at the end of the battle. So again, using war games to look at all of those issues is important. what is necessary is that actually we give the players the potential to make bad decisions, because if you design the war game such that it is a just war game for the way in which they are playing it, and it constrains them in that way, well, actually, you're not going to give them the chances to do the wrong things, which is what they may well have in real life. So I think it's quite important that the scope of the war game should be broad enough that they can make errors. So you've got things like the use of evil weapons there, and the requirement for military necessity, the requirements for proportionality. So it's quite important that the war game is structured in such a way that's open enough so as to allow all those things. And then finally, and the one that always gets missed is, is there a just peace? So we've got to the end of the war, there's some sort of peace treaty or some sort of ceasefire. What happens then? And ideally, of course, you want to make sure you war game this, again, probably using a sort of a matrix type approach before you even go to war, so you can understand what it is that's going to happen. You also need to be obviously quite cognizant of there's probably going to be an ongoing sort of grey zone type warfare going on, even though you've got to the end of the war. There's also a role here for sort of the more traditional sort of humanitarian games, the tabletop exercises, to come in, so as to think about how you manage things like sweat, how you manage wash within these particular situations. So I think there's a very good case for using wargaming to look at how we support or how we use just war theory. But we also need to make sure that the war games themselves are just in terms of how we consider the biases and how we consider the presentation of such games. So just to give you some examples of some of the things I've been doing that hopefully reflect some of these ideas. One of the projects we got involved with through my business for UK MOD, Land Warfare Centre, was about providing media synthetic wraps for their exercises. So they were running a series of urban warfare, urban war games at brigade and battalion level. These were being played out on quite a nice model of a town. Of course, the model of the town had absolutely no civilians in it whatsoever. And what they wanted to do was to immerse the players somehow in the sense of this is a city you are attacking. There are people are going to be affected. And so what we did is we wrote some software. This is pre-LLM days, where we could actually set up a basic dashboard, which is the sort of the diagram in the top center there is, of only about a dozen elements, which were very simple tick boxes or scalar boxes, that at the end of each of the wargame turns, we could very quickly, in a matter of seconds almost, set the values for what we thought represented the current state of the game, both in terms of the levels of aggression we were seeing, the state of things like electricity and the water supply. And then we just pressed a button and the software would then spit out as many tweets as we possibly wanted, and would also generate news articles for us as well. And those could all be passed into the J2 cell. And it gave the J2 cell the sense of actually sort of bit that they are fighting a battle, that if they do things, they are seeing a response to that. And it also gave a medium for the umpires to feed through injects into the exercise without having them to be a very obvious inject, delivered hand to mouth by some umpire's assistant. They would just actually add them into something, maybe a news agency reporting something or somebody on the ground reporting something, and then see whether or not the J2 cell actually spotted it and paid attention to it. So that was done as a software project in the old style. One of the things I looked at last year was saying, well, actually, can I reproduce this on an LLM? There's a link there to my Substack post about this. And essentially in an afternoon, I managed to reproduce most of the project. And I'm looking, hopefully some point in the next few months, to actually sort of release that through the website. And all you need to do if you're playing any war game is you just need to decide on sort of a reporting format that you're going to use. Just plain text so as to feed the summary of the game into the LLM. You give the LLM another file that sort of summarizes what the game is all about and what sort of characters you want to be generating social media feeds, and then basically press the button and the LLM will generate a whole bunch of social media for you. It'll generate news articles for you from print and website media. If you then hook it up to the appropriate other applications, it'll generate audio files and it'll generate talking head video characters for you to deliver the news as well. And so this is very much in that sort of atmospheric category that I described at the very beginning, just immersing people in the sense of there are being civilians who are being harmed by what you are doing, but without the need to actually have a sort of dedicated white cell playing the civilians. A slightly different take is a project that I did actually just at the beginning of this year. This was a joint project between the NATO ARRC headquarters here in the UK and then an organisation called Blue Shield. And what Blue Shield International is about protecting cultural property. And so they work with militaries, they work with governments to basically build lists of what are cultural property that needs to be protected, what are the right policies, what are the right pieces of doctrine to be established in order to ensure cultural property protection. But one of the things they were doing as part of revising their guidance was trying to understand to what extent does the density of cultural property impact on military operations. And so we ran an urban war game. We ran the war game 3 different times, looking at 3 different densities of cultural property protection. And if you look closely at the map there, you'll see all the little blue shields, which are the cultural property items. They were based on the real cultural property heritage list from the UK for this particular city. And we played the game through 3 times, and it was very much a seminar war game. So talking to the ARRC staff that were there and trying to understand what the impact was of the cultural property spread on their planning. I think that the 2 things that came out of it for me, and I'm not speaking for ARRC or for Newcastle University, who are the academics involved in this, but 2 things. The first one was it's typically the cultural property itself tends to be very clustered. So you don't get a particularly even lay down. You get a high density of of sites in one particular location, and then big gaps, and then another cluster. So it wasn't really the number of sites that would be important, but it was that amount of clustering and how many of those clusters there were. The second thing was that at the lowest level, if the military commander on the ground, or the battalion commander on the ground, is in sort of hot pursuit, then they have a fairly broad remit to be able to carry that hot pursuit over a standard piece of cultural property. So really the key thing was not so much the numbers of cultural property items that were there, but how they were spread across those 3 categories you can see there about special protection and enhanced protection. Because basically each of those meant it needed to be escalated sort of 1 higher in terms of the command chain. And so that's what was going to cause you problems. So a large number of very low standard registered cultural property wasn't going to cause too much issues. It was going to be up to individual commanders. It's about making sure those commanders are trained and knew what they were doing, and they would ideally be building into their plans anyway. But it's as you hit these enhanced protection items where you're sort of having to escalate up to sort of 1-star, 2-star headquarters, that's where the problems were more likely to arise. But the formal report on that is being written at the moment. And then just to finish off, just a couple of war games that I've generated as part of the PhD, which are looking at culture or include cultural harm issues. The first one is Urban Calculus. This is really a systems model of sort of how I think urban warfare works on a very broad, for a very broad perspective. What you've got in the center there is where the battle is taking place. That battle is then potentially generating civilian casualties, and it's potentially generating structural damage, and the amount of those will depend on whether you're using armor, whether you're using artillery as against just infantry. But if you're generating those 2 things, then they may well then feed through into things like global opinion. They may well feed through into civilian support, societal support. Structural damage will also have an impact on loss of livelihood long term. And the key thing about the game is not really so much the playing of it. It's actually, you'll notice that there's circles joining each of those boxes. And it's when you're thinking through a particular scenario, is thinking about, if we take the example of Gaza, we take the example of Ukraine, take the example of Iran at the moment, then what would be the appropriate values to go into those circles to represent the linkages between these different boxes? And in some cases, you may just say there is no linkage because either government is there for, or the media is so awash with this, it's just ceased paying it any attention. So it's a very short game, but it's a very good sort of game to have a discussion over and thinking through what some of the implications of things like civilian harm are. At a slightly more sort of technical type level, or technical level, but at an operational echelon, OPUC is my game for sort of fighting over the whole of Estonia. And you might just be able to notice in the photograph there's a couple of white meeples already on the board. What's interesting is those white meeples have come from the local cities they're next to. They haven't come from where the fighting is. Because again, one of the things we see from Ukraine is that, as the fighting edges closer, people in cities or towns 1 or 2 steps removed, they start to flee. So you need to look at how you deal with displaced persons that are coming from behind the front line, as well as from just as much as from on the front line, because the front line is going to empty out fairly fast. One of the things I do with this game is so as to give urban centers the right sort of weight in the game is whenever you actually have a battle on an urban center, I've then got smaller 15 centimeter little wargame mats, or beer mats as we would say in the UK, that basically represent that urban center, and so the fighting for the urban center transfers onto that mat. And you'll notice there we've got P and W, so that's power and that's water. And so there's the ability, or the possibility, that the fighting may well knock those out. If you knock those out, that increases the amount of displaced persons. Just off the picture, there's some boxes about what evacuation you've done on the city before the fight starts. And then those CEC checks is what I found is a very effective way of modeling civilian effects. So if anything happens during the course of the turn, which is likely to have a knock-on effect into the civilian infrastructure or the civilian population, you put a CEC chit down. And then at the end of the turn, you go through all the CEC chits that are on the board, and there's a fairly simple dice roll so as to work out what the impact of that is. So is that actually civilian casualties? Is it displaced persons? Is it structural damage in the form of rubberization? Or is it something like loss of power or loss of water? And as I say, I found that's been a fairly effective way of tracking those sort of civilian harm effects. So a fairly quick run through, but more than happy to take discussion questions when we get to discussion around any of those slides. Otherwise, back to you guys.
Because I've got quite a number of questions, but I think I'll hold my fire to the end. So now, Andrew, over to you. I'm really keen to see how you've been able to play out the CHM part. I'm really interested on the R part of the abbreviation, because that's often something that gets left behind. Even when we've done war games, because often or not we just ran out of time, or sometimes it was just too sensitive a topic to talk about. So really looking forward to this part of the presentation. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. All right, I will, hopefully the PDF version of the slides will have some less formatting issues here. Let me see if I can get them presenting. All right, wonderful. Thank you. So we talked a little bit about kind of background here. The one slide I realized I forgot to tee up here is one of my favorites on the cheese grater, or the cheese filters for preventing civilian harm. And I found this a useful construct to think about how does accidental civilian harm happening. It has to pass through all of these layers: a breakdown of command and control, poor understanding of the civilian environment, cognitive biases, not exploring mitigation options to get there. So I want to talk about professional wargaming, which is the kind of area that I sit in. David talked a little bit about some of the games that he's run for folks on cultural protection, right? Where I sit at CNA, I do both professional, analytic, and educational games, and talking about some of the work we've been doing with that. I want to highlight two different projects we've done in the last kind of 2024 and 2025 about Chimera, particularly in the context of large-scale combat operations, or how you incorporate the civilian environment into war games. I'll highlight a couple of resources for folks who are looking to do more on this, or have a conversation, and then we'll pause for questions. There's already that disclaimer down there at the bottom, but always good to do up front, right? All the things we're discussing are my views, not representing that of CNA, any of CNA sponsors, nor that of the DoD, Georgetown, or the U.S. Naval Academy. I am a wargame designer at CNA, where I've been for the last 4 years, and worked around DC prior to that. Done over 30 different games and executions, primarily for Department of Defense sponsors, but a whole bunch of folks, U.S. State Department, Pew Charitable Trust, National Academy of Sciences, etc. I've had the privilege of teaching at Georgetown for the last 2 years on wargame design, and I'll begin teaching a similar course in the fall at the U.S. Naval Academy. As I mentioned, in the last kind of 2.5 years, I've been really trying to help my team think about how do we include civilian harm within the context of our games, as well as running some projects on that specifically. Hopefully if you showed up to this presentation, you've already bought into our spiel, but it's worth saying, why is civilian harm relevant to the kinds of games that I do for the Department of Defense and associated government sponsors? I really like to put front and forward that war games are about human decisions and the impact of those decisions. We aim to represent whatever environment, situation, conflict, dynamic in the war game in a way that's useful to the players and the play of the game at the speed and that allows us to get through it over the course of our execution. That's plausible, right? That is realistic to the and buyable by the players, and robust to the key goal. We can't model everything in a war game. The world is infinitely complex, and I only have 2 days to play through things often, but robust against the key factors that are relevant to the game. Impact of the civilian population, because they have a major impact on the strategic objectives of operational planners, as well as the operational outcomes of military forces. It's important that we include civilian harm as part of our games, is what I argue here. It allows us to maintain freedom of action and maneuver. We talked about kind of the movement of civilian populations prior and during conflict. Can you use the same rail lines, the highways, etc.? Has the way you conducted the war allowed, if you're operating in someone else's, as a host nation or helping someone with their defense, are they allowing you to operate because of the way you're conducting yourself towards their civilian populations? As we talked about before, options for peace, alliances, narratives in domestic or sport. We already talked about kind of some of the moral and legal principles. The other one I'd tee up there is the moral injury to troops and a care for one's own forces. When we think about war games in the professional context, between educational war games, those designed to teach operators, military folks, analysts about a topic, have them experience decision-making, learn about a topic, and analytic games, we're hoping to better refine our research questions, explore the possible, understand how different approaches, operational plans, technologies might affect our decisions, affect our adversaries' decisions, find gaps and seams. Within that context, there's a couple of places you might find games that are CHMR games. One is the inclusion of civilian harm for training and education. If you're hoping to have folks understand about the reality of urban conflict, as David has highlighted, that will involve civilian harm. And so leaving that out of the game can lead to mislearning for misunderstanding of what an actual conflict would look like. It allows folks to make decisions in a safe-to-fail environment. So practice, how might they protect cultural property? How might they mitigate it? What kinds of dilemmas might they face, and get a chance to play through those? We can think about games about civilian harm as in games designed to help a command, a unit, an organization get better at its ability to understand, mitigate, and respond to civilian harms. So we can play games, think about what are the gaps of current planning structures, what are the gaps of current response structures. As we think about different kinds of conflicts, particularly as historically the US thought from transferring from what is thought of as low intensity counter-terror operations during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to large-scale combat operations, how might this change? What are the challenges for large-scale conflict in Europe or the Indo-Pacific that are different from the previous conflicts we fought? How do we mitigate? What kind of intelligence would be necessary? So thinking with a J2 shop, for example. And finally, to think about it for a strategic level discussion, employing the strategic consequences of different outcomes of a war, and how that would affect peacemaking at the end, or what kinds of things we might want to buy or approach based on our overall strategic ends. I'm going to highlight two projects we've worked on that speak a little bit to some of the challenges that we've found using wargaming as a technique, as well as later on what are the current challenges for including civilian harm in war games based on our conversations with folks. And then I'll end with some of my reflections for both these projects, as well as talking with other folks. So the first game I want to highlight here was for U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which is the organization that oversees the U.S. forces operating in Japan and the Philippines, Hawaii, kind of the Western Pacific. The question we were trying to help them answer, this was derived kind of from that trimmer action plan I mentioned before, as they were thinking about how do we implement this directive. How can we put this at what's called a joint task force? But it's an organization of forces. How do we do a large-scale combat operation with speed and scale and all these different assets? How do we make sure we've included and inculcated civilian harm mitigation at every step of our planning process? The effort was sponsored by the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence, the CPCOE, who I previously mentioned, as well as the Indo-PACOM J5S, so part of their planning shop. As part of it, we looked through an abstracted planning structure and have the players think about at every step of planning out a military operation, what kind of information about the civilian environment or civilians do they want to have when they're making those decisions? Why do they want that information? For us, that was really important to understand. What are you hoping to do with it? Why is it valuable? Why is it worth putting resources against this? And then where can you get that information? In what form, speed, etc. The information may exist, as in someone has mapped it, whether on Google Maps or maybe a Civic has it, or the Red Cross has the information, etc. Your ally has information about the city. How are you getting it into the planning process? Is there someone in the room with access to it? Is it in a form that's useful? We built out a kind of abstract structure a little bit above and below what usual operators would think of as the joint task force structure. This is because they're hoping to understand what kind of intelligence or staffing needs to exist at different levels. So we went from, hey, what does the commander, when they're giving their intent, when they tell their soldiers, when they tell their sailors, the Marines, etc., what they want to have happen, what kind of information do they need as they make that high level bid? All the way down to, after a mission executes, what do we want to know about that mission, and how are we going to get it? And be able to respond to any reports, either internally or externally, of civilian harm. I've included some vignettes here pulled from previous work and discussion that CNA has done on civilian harm mitigation for illustrative purposes. I realized I didn't highlight this in my disclaimer, but I really want to emphasize a lot of the work I did here was pulled from previous work CNA had done over the last 20 years. Folks like Larry Lewis, whose name you'll see often on the slide, Marla Keenan, Zach Gold, Sabrina Verlessen, and others. A lot of what I've been doing is just taking this body of work that they have developed, this theory, this practice, all the research, and trying to apply it to wargaming specifically. So as you look at dilemmas, you can think about what are the kinds of challenges that operators might face, that therefore they might face in a wargaming context we should think through and be ready to respond to. How can we use wargames to better explore some of these topics? And so we put players right through similar vignettes and asked them to walk through all of that cycle and articulate what was needed, what would they need to have, and why. So you can think about self-defense in an urban environment, as David's already highlighted. We could talk about what if the environment is comms denied, but you have limited access to GPS or locations. How do you think about mitigating harm in dense civilian populations where there may be co-location of military and civilian sites? The quick look for this report is available online. It's currently posted to my LinkedIn, and you can find it there, which has some kind of high-level takeaways from this project. But as we played through the game and asked the players to reflect on what they learned or what was true from the kind of gaps and challenges they were facing, one of the first one was, as I mentioned, the commander's intent. The way the military works is everything relies off of what have I told you my vision is? What does the commander want to have happen? If the commander hasn't articulated an end state relevant to the civilian environment, that often just falls off part of the planning cycle. Similarly, operators will talk about the commander owning risk. One of the jobs of officers is to understand the risk to force or mission or the civilian population and say that that's acceptable or not acceptable, to make that decision to the best of their knowledge. If we haven't defined for our leadership what kinds of civilian harm are likely to result from our actions, either on an individual scale for a targeting decision, or more appropriately for the kind of campaign we intend to wage, they can't own that risk. They're taking on undefined risk. Similarly, thinking about how it's built into planning. One of the challenges is historically responding can often be a kind of one-off. There is an accidental targeting of a wedding or a hospital during a conflict, and it gets a lot of attention and going forward. But if you're imagining a conflict where you're prosecuting large number of targets at the same time, how do you know that you're off plan? How do you know that because war is almost inevitably going to cause civilian casualties, how do you know if this is the kind of civilian casualties you expected and have done everything you can to mitigate or not? Are you tracking on the aggregate level? I get it, if you had a strike that killed 200 people, you'd probably be able to respond to that. But if you had 200 strikes that killed 10 people, are you aware of the level of harm that's happening? You can see some other ones there, kind of specific either to the kind of game we're looking at, a large-scale conflict. One of the things that often comes up is the concern that forces will be improperly blamed for civilian harm that they didn't commit. That there might be malicious actors who are spreading misinformation about operating forces. Well, but to be able to respond effectively to that misinformation, you need to be able to know what you have and have not done. And so having a robust, responsive, and transparent process about how you have mitigated harm and being able to respond is key to being able to respond to that. The final one to highlight here is about the scale of conflict. If you are thinking about waging a large-scale collective defense effort in Europe or a large-scale conflict in the Indo-Pacific, there is a challenge of who is keeping all of this information centralized, who has the job to make sure that if we have, in fact, hit 200 targets with 5 off-target effects for each, that we have that noted and responded to, that we have a sense of whether our munitions are working the way we want. So pivoting from, that was a game where we used wargaming or a TTX to explore what should a command do better or better implement the vision outlined in the civilian harm mitigation action plan. What instead is the state of professional military wargaming within the DoD about the incorporation of the civilian environment? So the goal here was thinking about what is currently incorporated into DoD wargames. We had conversations with folks, subject matter experts across the DoD. We did a number of workshops and literature reviews to say, hey, what's the current state of the field? There was a couple of themes of why might it be challenging, or what are the kind of challenges for integrating the civilian environment into games. One is we execute professional games to meet research or educational objectives. And sometimes those objectives can be fairly narrowly scoped. Go take this hill, quote unquote, defeat this adversary, destroy this force. And if you have a fairly narrow set of objectives, then the effects that you're having in the civilian environment all fall below the cut line. As I talked about before, we often have to abstract large amounts of a conflict, whether it's logistics or the command and control or the air element or anything else, just to be able to get after the question that we want. And so the civilian environment can be left out of that when it's seen as not relevant. And similar to challenge to get sponsors to buy in, even when the designer or the research suggests that it is, there can be some hesitation to do so. Similarly, as I think Marco highlighted before, wargames can often focus on the start of conflict rather than either later or the termination of conflict. And therefore, players can maybe outrun the consequences of their actions. The kinds of impacts to their operational or strategic objectives from the harm that may be caused from the approach that they took may not be visible during the timeline of the game. Similarly, because we need to execute these games in limited time fashion, there's a concern that really focusing on a specific instance of harm can be too disruptive to the playing of the game. When we think about positive practice, one of the things that really stood out to me about the stuff that folks conveyed was the need to connect it to player choice. While there are games where you'll roll a 1 or draw a card randomly and found out you caused civilian harm, when we're thinking about games in a professional context, we want to make sure that the players feel like they had control or at least a decision over the things that might have caused harm. Did I give them targeting decisions? Did I let them experience approaches? Did I give them information about the environment they are operating in so they could make different choices? If it feels like you're just springing the kind of trap on the players, they'll disengage and be very frustrated that it feels like you've kind of pulled the rug out from instead of letting them play through an actual operational process where they may be able to mitigate some of that harm. Finally, although I think work by David and others is doing a great job to build out a catalog of the tools we may have as a wargaming field to incorporate this, the perspective from a lot of the professionals was there's not a lot of off-the-shelf models for estimating civilian harm or modeling it in the way there might be other off-the-shelf tools for things like energy infrastructure, missile interception, etc., as well as the difficulty of accessing civilian harm experts in the civilian environment to play in games. Analytic games in particular, but overall professional military war games often rely on experts being in the room. And so if there aren't experts native to a command or able to travel or funding, et cetera, they may not be able to represent it well. and so that can be another challenge. So I've been kind of doing this for the last 2 years, highlighted 2 projects here, and been doing some writing as well. And so when I've been thinking about what are some kind of key takeaways for me as we think about as a field, what should we do about presenting civilian harm in professional war games? The first is making sure that we've had a discussion about it before the initiation of conflict. One of the easy steps is asking players to define an end state for the civilian environment. How do you want this to look once you're done with it? Can trigger a lot of good conversation and learning that might not otherwise have. As I mentioned, right, making sure players have decisions and agency, both so that they learn what they could do in the real world, as well as keeping that buy-in for the game itself. When you're designing games, as the same way you're thinking about what could my players do to opposing forces, what might they need, what kind of information might be relevant, envisioning where the kind of, if it's an operational game, as this study, which I think I didn't mention at the top, this was game specifically, or specifically looking at operational war games, so those focused on movement and employment of military forces versus a strategic or policy or logistics, etc. game. Where might those forces interact with civilian environment and therefore have information on hand to think through? Particularly also, where might the second and third order, so even maybe just not the harm itself, but what are the cascading consequences that are relevant to the game's objectives? This game might be about the feat of an adversary incursion, but part of the second and third order consequence is the stability of the ally that we're protecting, and how we included that calculus and those consequences in part of the play and therefore the learning. As David mentioned, so one of the kind of the importance of having it visible to players, because one of the great things about particularly analog war games is the physical pieces in front of things. It makes things visible and keeps things mentally relevant. And if there isn't a cube or a marker or another way of which it has been made visible to the players that there is civilian harm and infrastructure occurring in the course of the game, it won't be relevant to the conversations or the play. It'll be out of sight and out of mind, which isn't a fault on any of the players. This is true for any element. If I don't include a logistics element in the game, players understandably think that part's been abstracted out of our conversation. I highlighted a couple of these in our conversation so far, but I'll tee them up again. As I mentioned before, the link on LinkedIn, on my LinkedIn, you can find the quick look report for that war game we did with Indo-PACOM. Available on the CNA website is some of our research that my work has built on, such as thinking about civilian harm in large-scale combat operations, which is a great paper by my colleagues. I'm working on trying to get the player packet we developed for that war game available for public release, particularly as it has a lot of kind of step-by-step planning conversations about what information might be relevant at different steps of decisions that could be useful for facilitating conversations, either with allies and partners or for other parts of the U.S. military or government. And finally, back in 2023, I believe I made this, when the Schumer Action Plan was more of the kind of key driving force behind this, we made a document about how might wargamers better include civilian harm in their professional war games. And that's available upon request. So please feel free to email me if you'd like to know more about that, and even if the framing is perhaps a little out of date. If you've got questions on the wargaming parts of this, you can reach me at the email above, or the head of the wargaming team on the right. If you've got specific questions on the framework of civilian harm mitigation or CHIMR, I've listed my colleagues' names there. I'll pause for questions from the group, and then Marco, I think you teed one up that I may not have addressed about playing the response element. So if we don't get anything from the audience, I'll spend some time talking about that. Sure. So the question I see in the chat is tendency of troops to dehumanize anyone who isn't part of their unit or army. So in the professional context, right, I'm going to assume the best and assume what the players tell me, because the goal of the games that I run is either about getting good information out of folks or about allowing them to train. And so as part of the games that I would run, we would think about making visible the consequences of players' actions, and in good faith, hey, here, if we took this approach, here might be the consequences either to the operation, the strategic level, the civilian population, etc. There's various tools David mentioned, media wraps, right? Making visible through imagery and stories, a personally compelling narrative, putting it forward on the play, connecting it to national objectives. The kinds of games I do aren't going to assume anything negative about the folks that I'm operating with. And I want to say very clearly, all of the folks I work with are professionals, and I operate to the highest standard of professionalism, and often come to the game with good faith and real interested in learning about what we have to say. So I'll pass it over to other folks. If either David, Marco, you want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the way I've done it, is a lot of my games, I have this idea of an adverse opinion track, which basically tracks all the bad things you do, which can then be used as sort of part of the debrief. But what I do in some games is basically that track is asymmetric, or the response to that track is asymmetric. So things like civilian harm may well be tracked for both sides, but actually one side, as part of its brief, representing red, may be told, well, actually just ignore the track and you go ahead and you just do whatever you want. And so that, to a certain extent, is reflecting the way that one faction may well consider the other faction to be just not worth worrying about. Whereas the blue faction may well feel, it's got the weight of politics and democratic institutions behind it. So that's the very simple way that I've used.
Yeah, I totally agree also with what Andrew said with regards to it's a very sensitive topic, because you don't want to already create friction with the training audience by, implying that this is something that could happen. And I'd actually take one step further. One of the challenges I've had when dealing with security forces, and as I've said, I've had the privilege of working with security forces from across the globe. There can be sometimes, not always, and I'm not even saying the majority of the times, but there is sometimes a bit of initial resistance to overcome, as sometimes, particularly when civilians come and deliver on this topic, there can be the perception that we're coming to teach them how to do their job. And I think I'll go back to something I think, again, Andrew said earlier, that there is sometimes pushback also because the military is like, I am trying to do so much in a very resource constrained environment, and you're telling me to do something else. And so one of the narratives we often push is, we're not asking you to do something else. We're here to try and help you. We're not trying to tell you what to do, but we're trying to help you to do things even better. So to be more effective in your military operations in various ways. But one way we kind of try and introduce this theme is by usually having a partnered force that's working with our training audience, and we kind of sneakily use them as the proxy that does things that they shouldn't do. Also because, combined joint operations, these things can happen. So we also pose the challenge of, how do you mitigate harm, again, from the actions of others, and this time not necessarily from the adversary, but from your partnered force. And that's always a very interesting dynamic. And how do you mitigate the risk of planning an operation so that you're kind of setting yourself up for failure? And one of those examples was, we were wargaming the retaking of a previously occupied territory, and there was a pocket of resistance fighters who had chosen to stay behind. And it was pretty much, we gained the momentum, the adversary was retreating. So we put the question to the blue force, okay, how are you going to retake this small part of the urban area? And I think, still suffering from a little bit of hangover from counterinsurgency operations periods, they said, well, we'll get the local forces, the host nation forces, to go in. We'll do the cordon on the outside and they'll go in. And so we posed the question, so you want the host nation force to go in and engage a part of the population that is definitely perceived as having betrayed the nation. Do you see any challenges in that? And once we kind of put that angle, we had that aha moment where they realized that perhaps that was not the wisest course of action. So again, to summarize, as Andrew had said, we try to stay away from implying that the blue force could do that, but we can find ways around it so that they still have to deal with that dilemma. Andrew, do you want to take the next one?
Sure. I'm not seeing another question that came up. Oh, there we go. What are the active civilian effects models? Past resistance, partisans, Baker children. Sure. Then this is a great one. I'll give a short answer to, and thanks. David might have the best answer to this, which is there are all kinds of ways in which civilians might be an active part of a game that I might run, right? They may be a passive kind of reality in the space, right? Refugee flows, etc. There may be folks who are there to give ISR, etc., or give kind of targeting or intelligence to another force. I think there's some great work by some of the folks who've staffed kind of NATO green cells before, thinking about what way might the civilians actually be an active party here? Why might they have agency and choice? I think that particularly is even more important when we think about educational games. So not when I'm trying to do a game about, what's the best way to use a rail network in Europe, but as we're thinking about training future officers, thinking about the ways that folks aren't just going to do the thing you want them to and are going to respond with their own agency. So, David, over to you for some thoughts on this one.
Yeah, certainly sort of second with the various sort of models you talked about. One of the ones that in some of my games, particularly where you've got an urban area where you may well have a part of that urban area which is sympathetic to the people who are trying to attack the area, then obviously there's the chance to sort of use sort of agent provocateur or to use agents to actually activate those civilians and get those civilians to do useful stuff for you. And during the shape phase, that could actually be using them to detect things like headquarters locations, SAM sites, various sort of high value targets. It could be doing sabotage. It could be once the fighting, or at least once it's getting close to fighting, just blockading sections. So that's sort of one way in which I've used them. Looking more broadly at the games I'm looking at, then the use of civilians as mobs is quite common. And those mobs can change from being sort of relatively passive mobs to being very angry mobs who are actually coming at you. Mog, which I think I've got there behind me, that does it quite nicely in the context of Mogadishu. And several other of the games often have urban operations. I think it has what it calls no man's land counters. And you come across a counter, it's a civilian, but you don't know whether it's a civilian who's a friendly civilian or a civilian who turns into an insurgent. I think some of the other examples I've seen, which are more broader, tend to fall into counterinsurgency type games, where obviously the civilians are a far more sort of ongoing part of the conflict, and there's far more of a grey area in terms of the roles of the different ones. So I'd certainly look to some of the counterinsurgency games for a broader range of examples.
I saw one of the comments in the chat was on kind of the humanitarian relief and the U.S. military. While not strictly a civilian harm type game, there are plenty of games that are about what the U.S. military call HADR, or humanitarian disaster relief. And so there is a pretty robust field of wargaming about humanitarian response, either by militaries or by NGOs. I saw someone in the chat brought up the great game Aftershock, which thinks specifically about bringing folks into after an earthquake or after a disaster, which I've used in classes before. So there is a whole branch of games about how can the Marine Expeditionary Force or U.S. Forces Europe or anyone else do part of that core mission, which is humanitarian disaster relief or support to allies and partners who suffer a similar event. Yeah,
and I've included Aftershock in the analysis I'm doing of urban war games. As you say, it has quite a good representation of particularly that after the war phase and how you do the recovery and the transition.
Before we push on with the questions, if I might just steal a couple of minutes to share some of my experience as well. So as noted, I've had a slightly easier approach to wargaming in the sense that mine's been a little bit less structured, more the matrixed live participation. One thing that I wanted to start off with is most of our games have been obviously with a training focus to support military forces, usually on their request, to help them better understand the civilian environment and how to mitigate harm, both from own actions and actions of others. Now, interestingly enough, most people usually assume that our primary training audience has been the civ-mil cooperation function or civil affairs when we're talking about US training audiences. And while we've always very much welcomed the participation of those particular functional areas because they're usually a little bit more aware of these problematics, we've always very much advocated that our key training audience, the way we see it, is usually what we define as the carnivores of the headquarters, and that's the intel function, the planners, and the current operations, because essentially that is where civilian harm mitigation, protection of civilians, and human security, that's where the rubber hits the road. For these efforts to mitigate harm to be effective, it is those components of the headquarters that needs to be aware of these practices and how to best plan current and future operations. And generally speaking, that's been very welcomed. At the beginning, there's always a bit of resistance, but the way we usually structure the training events is that we conduct a little bit of training in the morning sessions so that they're more familiar with the frameworks that they can leverage and what are the potential roles that each function could have in this crucial effort. And once we've done that, we then give them the game, and so they have a direct opportunity to apply what they've learned a few hours earlier. And as I said, initially, there's a little bit of disgruntled natureness of the 2, the 3, and the 5. So as they don't necessarily immediately see the relevance of their role, but after the theory session and direct application, they usually come away much more aware of the whole thing. Now, the problem has been, particularly when we started back in 2020 and 2021, I would say that the level of engagement, the traction that this subject has seen a lot of peaks and troughs. Obviously, back in the time of counterinsurgency operations, wargaming these themes when we were all about capturing hearts and minds was quite relevant. It was quite evident the role that these kind of games would have. As much of the Western military has then started to shift towards large-scale combat operations, Article 5, whatever you want to call it, there seemed to be a bit more hesitancy, and much of the thinking was, well, the ends will justify the means in an existential fight. If we have to break a few eggs to maintain independence, sovereignty, etc., then so be it. So the period up until the 24th of February 2022, so the period up until Russia's renewed invasion of Ukraine, it was a little bit harder. However, since then, when so many Western leaders have seen a national leader like Zelensky advocate for the protection of his civilian population just as much as he has about territorial integrity and sovereignty, that really landed with a lot of our senior military leaders, and it became much, much easier to start talking about these themes within a large-scale combat operations context. As most of you can imagine, following recent political changes on the international scene, we've now seen a regression in many places and many organizations as well. However, it seems to not be a uniform it's not a uniform situation. It's been very comforting to see nations like Poland, for example, really start to sit up and take notice of these problematics, particularly when it comes to evacuating the civilian population, particularly along certain areas. It's not just Poland, a lot of the Baltic states, as you can imagine, looking at how to better defend critical national infrastructure, how to align civil preparedness plans and military plans from the local level all the way up to the national level. So it really seems like there's a bit of a mix in the level of engagement that we can successfully have on these themes. What I found to be rather useful in securing a certain degree of traction has been really underlining, I think Andrew and David have both done a really good job on that, the strategic, operational and tactical imperative that understanding how the civilian environment can impact on military operations. So while most humanitarians that I've worked with would prefer to advocate for the legal and the moral imperative, I found it much more useful to try and leverage how the civilian environment can impact military operations. And we can do that there's so many different ways that this can be done. Andrew has spoken beautifully about also how this has a key role in ensuring greater military efficiency across the board. One such way is, of course, if you're generating civilian harm, because it's usually not intentional, that means that your ordnance are not going where you desired for them to land. Therefore, you have a certain degree of military inefficiency. That's only one of many ways. But also understanding when we talk what we mean by the civilian environment, because personally, as someone in uniform, to me, the civilian population was one big uniformed group of civilians with no agency. Obviously, the reality is much, much different. When we talk about the civilian environment, we are talking about also international organizations, NGOs, etc., who at first glance in a large-scale combat operation, you might argue, well, how relevant are they? But I'm sure David can speak to this point. When you start to talk about urban operations, the scale of the impact of conflict within that environment is so large that there's no military, it doesn't matter how big you are, that you can do that alone. And very often, the assistance that the civilian population will require usually goes beyond what the military is capable of providing, particularly when fighting against a peer or near peer adversary. Therefore, that cooperation and coordination with non-military actors becomes essential. And I think one of the points that's often landed very well with our training audiences has been when we've taken, for example, the liberation of Kherson back in 2022, if memory serves. It was a brilliant military victory. The Ukrainians were exceptional at pushing the Russians out of the city. But through our engagement with Ukrainian civil society, military as well, and also some political players, not enough consideration was given to what do we do when we take the city back? And have we assessed what we believe to be the situation within the civilian environment? And when they went in, it was much worse than what they expected. The political level became rapidly aware of this, and they rapidly told the military to hold in place to relieve some of that pressure on the civilian environment until reinforcements could be sent in, particularly humanitarians, etc., and local NGOs to alleviate some of that pressure. And of course, that cost the military to lose the initiative and the momentum, and allowing the Russians then to cross the Dnipro and set up defensive positions where they still are today. So that, I think, is a rather eloquent example of how failing to understand the civilian environment can really punish the military in critical moments, and of also the crucial role that international organizations, NGOs, particularly local NGOs, can have. And again, that civilian agency becomes really apparent. But again, when we talk about the civilian environment, for example, as I've already alluded to previously, when we do our matrix games, of course, we have the blue force, we have red, and then we have what we call the white, which is intentionally divided into mini groups within the team. So we'll assign one role of the national government to one part of the white team. We'll have international actors, we'll have NGOs, and we'll have parts of the civilian population where we'll intentionally say, you are pro-blue team, you are pro-red team. What are you going to do in this particular context? We give them usually 30, 40 minutes to plan, and then we have them back brief. And this really has been very helpful in helping the military to see that the civilian environment isn't uniform. It's very diverse. And the better you can plan against that, the more effective your operations are going to be and lower the risk of strategic surprise. I think Ukraine has also really rammed home the importance of understanding the civilian environment, the degree of resilience, what you can expect. Of course, we've seen a very active civilian population being leveraged by the state to help in defense. That's unquestionably really important. But particularly from a protection of civilians perspective, it's really important to also learn how you can do that responsibly and how you can do that while also remaining aligned with IHL. And I'm not implying that Ukraine did not, but in some of the courses of actions that we've initially seen on how Blue Team has tried to leverage the civilian population, we've had some questionable outcomes that needed some addressing during the back brief. But all of this really comes under one of the key I'm really quite a fan of the NATO approach for various reasons. It's also my first approach to this theme. The overarching component that really holds together the mitigating harm, the facilitating access to basic needs, and the creation of a safe and secure environment is the ability to effectively understand the human environment, or UHE. And I think that this part is really crucial to understanding all of that. So understanding what is the level of resiliency within the population, what are their vulnerabilities against what the resources resources available, both from within the affected communities and what the military can potentially try to pull from the non-military active component. Who are the perpetrators of violence? Who are the potential protectors that the military can work with? All this really helps to break down the civilian environment and better understand it to then plan more effectively. One aspect that we've really found to be quite interesting for military actors, particularly within the NATO environment, but not only, is the nexus between protection of civilians, resiliency, and resistance. So the theory essentially is if a civilian population is not sufficiently protected, their bandwidth to also resist and support the military becomes drastically reduced. So this kind of also challenges NATO's approach to resiliency in general. NATO has a national resilience policy where it identifies 7 baselines that must be preserved as much as possible to enable the military to fight. In our war games, we don't challenge that, but we also offer another perspective that is complementary to that. How can you also preserve that critical national infrastructure? How can you manage the mass movement of populations? How can you ensure energy continuity with limited resources to also protect the civilian population? Because as your baselines become degraded, yes, your ability to stay in the fight becomes is reduced, but so is your ability to protect. So as you dedicate resources, and this is particularly important at the operational level, but also the strategic, as you allocate resources, for example, limited air defense assets, where are you going to locate those? Are you going to locate those in support of your critical national infrastructure? Are you going to put it in residential areas? And there is no, and the whole purpose, particularly of the back brief, after we take a look at the courses of action, the action and the counter reaction, one of the things that we really focus on is there's not necessarily a right answer. The importance is to have mitigation efforts planned that can counter wherever your resources run short. One other thing that we've kind of struggled with a little bit is securing a really solid red team. It is quite challenging, particularly for Western militaries, but not only, to really take their blue hats off and fully immerse themselves in the red role. So we have often leveraged the capability or the knowledge and experience, unfortunately, of Ukrainian veterans who have been able to give us a degree of fidelity in replicating the red team that I've not often seen elsewhere. I found that to be really, really useful and interesting. One of my big do's, however, for the wargame is because the organization I used to work for, Pax for Peace, was very much focused on leveraging the civilian working with local partners. We were able to bring a lot of these people in to really give a first-hand account of the situations that the civilian population face in conflict. This one has made the whole experience of the war game much more engaging, and particularly at an emotional level, but has also given insight that you can't find anywhere else. And also bringing in these international organizations and NGOs and distributing them within the blue team to help them also navigate some of the challenges, some of the sensitivities with that cooperation between the humanitarians and the military has been really, really helpful. And while it unquestionably has a training value for the military, we've also found that the reverse has also been true. Working and planning with military actors in a war game context has also helped humanitarians often understand what the limitations are with regards to military assistance in those contexts. I saw in the comment section as well how the military is a great provider of humanitarian aid. I would add that it's not humanitarian aid, it is assistance, because for it to be humanitarian, that assistance would be given to any part of the affected civilian population, including the adversary, and that doesn't often happen. It's these little differences, well, they might seem little at face value, but actually the reasoning behind them and the friction that this can create between actors is really, really interesting and important. And this has probably been one of my biggest failures during probably one of the first war games that I had a lead role in supporting. We had brought in quite a number of civilians from the UN, from the NGO community, etc. And they were meant initially to be observers and to help us back brief at the end of each round. Simply putting them to the side instead of actually embedding them with the blue team created a significant amount of friction with the blue team, to the point where we had to actually create a timeout and redistribute the observers into the teams so that they weren't feeling judged as much as they were feeling supported. Again, it doesn't seem like it would be so complicated, the seating arrangement of the war game, but it was actually really quite important. One last don't I would have is, very often our war games, particularly at the operational level, but not only, we tend not to go too much into the weeds when it comes to orders of battle, force laydown, etc., because particularly when you're pushing players outside of their comfort zone to discuss themes that they're not highly familiar with, giving them something like that, they tend to default back to their comfort zones and go really down rabbit holes with regards to, okay, we're going to deploy forces here. What kind of capabilities do they have there? And that takes away from the actual main themes, which is, of course, civilian harm mitigation and protection of civilians. So very often we try to remain a little bit generic. The facilitator will respond to specific questions on, okay, but do I have this? Can I rely on that? But that has worked really well in allowing them to focus on what we really want them to remain concentrated on. And I'll stop there, and we'll check the questions section.
Marco, I wanted to really double down on, I think, a great comment you made about deployment of air defense assets, right, and critical infrastructure. One of the points that actually my partner brought up, who works over at NDU, if you were doing a collective defense example, and given kind of the way the Russians have deployed their assets in Ukraine, if you haven't reserved a certain amount for targeting of critical infrastructure or destruction of rail or anything else, and I say, red, do whatever you want, hit the counters on the map, we're actually misrepresenting the likely kind of Russian approach to this. And then similarly, right, if we haven't modeled the political pressure to protect one's civilians or critical government offices or whatever else, you may have an unrealistic picture of what kind of air defense you may have access to or other kind of assets. So just an operational realism, having a better sense of it, can actually draw us to better learning. And
if I can just kind of add to that, David, I'd also really be, well, both of you, but considering, David, your focus on urban warfare, one thing that I found really surprising is, well, perhaps not, but I've always found that the military obviously focuses on taking back the city when we're doing offensive operations in urban. And the focus is usually also on, okay, how do I mitigate, it's more CHM approach, how do I mitigate civilian casualties from my own actions? But they don't think about, okay, once I go in there, like, do I need to pre-coordinate with the other actors who probably have the resources that I will need once I move in? Do they consider what happens when they retake the urban area? You're probably not going to have a lot of law enforcement there. There's probably not going to be any local administrators. So do you have the rules of engagement to do that? These were all things that came up when we were working with Ukrainians. They wanted a war game on retaking previously occupied territory, and we gave them that, but we also weaved in a lot of CHM and POC challenges that were connected to these issues here. Have you found that the people that you've been working with have been interested in these themes as well? Have they considered them?
Yes, I think to an extent, my exposure to it has been relatively limited, but certainly on things like the ARRC exercise we did, the military police component was actually quite a significant part of the exercise. So both in terms of the representation of, in the players, but then also in terms of the actions. So there was definitely an interest there or an awareness there of the need to have the policing support. And the 40th Infantry Division urban planning course that used to be ran in California. I know within that, there was a policing lecture as part of that, looking at the policing issues. So I think there's definitely an awareness of it, but I'm not close enough to know what sort of dialogues are going on, and in terms of where you might pull those resources in order to provide the policing, and also things like the fire resources. I mean, if you haven't seen it, the 20 Days in Mariupol documentary is well worth watching. And in fact, one of the things I did last couple of months was actually put a piece up on my blog where I actually went through day by day on that video and recorded the state of the city and what was still working and what was still not working. And one of the interesting things in that is sort of the day when the last fire engine gets blown up. And all of a sudden, you know, the city has no fire cover, not only for what obviously happens to it immediately, but what might happen sort of come the end of the actual hot conflict side of it. So yeah, so from what evidence I've seen, it suggests yes, there are dialogues going on, but I'm not exposed as to what those are. I mean, just echoing back on one of your points about sort of understanding the human environment. One of the things I did this USEX model and making sure you understand before you go in and do the fight. One of my games, City and Seamer, which is the sort of the whole city or the big chunk of a city type game. In the understand phase for that, what I have is as part of, I give the players a very generic briefing or a very high level briefing of what the city is about. But what I then do is I give them basically an intelligence budget. And then I have a whole set of 1- and 2-page briefs covering all the different aspects of the city they might want to know about. And it's up to them to sort of prioritize, you know, do we want to know about fire? Do you want to know about police? Do you want to know about the CCTV coverage? Do you want the deep down demographics so you can work out, you know, where the problem areas of the city are going to be? Do you want to know where the DIY stores are so you can go and raid them for all of the stuff for your defense works and stuff like that? And that's quite a good exercise about getting the players to really think about, okay, what's the important information? What do I need to know in order to understand the city, understand the fabric of the city, the infrastructure, you know, where are the sewer pipes, where are the flood risks, all those things, because potentially you can make use of those during the actual combat.
Do we have any more questions in that?
I noticed there's a question about the status of adversary cultural resources. Not something I'm particularly aware of, but certainly the Blue Shield organization is the one that's trying to understand. I don't know what dialogue they've got through into the Russian side, but their website would probably be a good place to start in terms of what understanding there might be about potential adversary cultural resources. But I think that the problem is that the one that's just been alluded to is that most of the wars we're looking at fighting are where we're retaking stuff that we used to know about, rather than taking new stuff.
Oh, great. Go ahead, Andrew.
Came up earlier as we were thinking about working with kind of professional military operators, and one of the pushbacks Marco highlighted is. And I 100% agree. Like our force, particularly the U.S. forces, are trained to operate under international human rights law and the law of armed conflict. And so when we think about kind of talking about civilian harm or civilian harm mitigation, it's not a saying that you don't. It's a here is how we can offer you resources to do it better, right? It's not as incredibly tragic and should be prevented. A strike on a hospital that you didn't, or a school that you didn't know was a school, that you had every reason to believe and the intelligence was good and you've done the mitigations, that is technically legal, but it's a strategic disaster. It's a moral disaster. You know, it's everything you'd want to prevent. And so coming to them with, hey, how can we give you frameworks and resources and improve the processes and think about who needs to be in the room? Because I fully believe you're doing everything you can. Let me come with more. Let me play a game with you. Let's bring these resources, right? Do this training, whatever else. And I think once you make that switch, then folks are really excited because they always want to do their job better. They always want to prevent innocent deaths where possible. And so once you can get that switch, it's a tense 10 minutes at the beginning of the presentation. But once you can go beyond that, I found folks very open.
Another thing I dealt with, particularly prior to Russia's renewed aggression on Ukraine, was the common line of, but we're doing this already. Like, it's just, IHL adherence. We know that. We've been trained on that. We're good at that. And again, this is not me trying to criticize from the outside in. I wore the uniform. I went to multiple deployments in Afghanistan. And one point that I often put to them is we tried to do it in Afghanistan, and we think we did it in Afghanistan. We fought for 20 years, never lost a battle, but we still lost. And granted, a lot of reasons go into that, but one of the standouts, even from the US report at the end, the 6-hour report at the end of the conflict, also stated that we just were not credible protection actors. And a lot of that went into also our failure to effectively protect. And of course, McChrystal's tactical directives tried to change some of that. And if you look at the stats for a really long time, it did. The integration with civilian harm mitigation and response cell was also highly effective, not just in mitigating harm, but it also played a vital role in ensuring that we learnt from our mistakes. Now, I hear a lot that, those efforts aren't important. We can't track civilian harm on a large-scale combat operations. I don't believe that. We're able to use AI for offensive operations. Surely we can also use it, for example, to help us track, particularly when potentially a lot of those civilian casualties will happen on friendly territory. The possibility to verify, to engage, to understand what happened is even better than what it was in areas where we just didn't have access to the terrain. What do you gents think about that?
So the question of AI integration is multifaceted and complex, but I think the point you made on knowing what has occurred in a systematic way that we can make improvement and then do organizational learning is a key bit. One of the great privileges and challenges for working with an analytic organization is the structure of kind of large commands. It's hard to move the needle. And one of the things I get the privilege to do is provide some of the analytic background and hopefully provide the structure that others can then build on. So whether it's AI or sometimes just a person with a spreadsheet, sometimes it's just, I got to tell someone to take the notes. Both are key. And I think the development of tools to make it visible to commander, make it visible to the operators, allow us to respond effectively, I think is a deeply worthwhile investment. And I hope it is occurring.
Yeah, when I was talking to the FAS team at the Red Cross sort of early on in the PhD, I mean, it was one of the messages they were trying to get across to me was that what they are about is trying to get the militaries to go beyond what IHL and LOAC says. That is really they see that certainly for Western militaries, if you like, as being the minimum bar. And you should really be aiming a lot higher than that in terms of what you do. I mean, one question for you guys, again, something else that came up in the conversation with them, was the lack of a sort of almost a civilian player guide, a sort of white player guide. Because obviously, if you've got the time and the effort and the money to bring in real live humans, that's great. But if you haven't, and you've got a SO3, J2's suddenly got to pick up the job, there doesn't appear to be a lot of material out there that you can use to actually brief them as to how. And it was obviously need to be something that's culturally specific and appropriate. But if you are suddenly playing, civilians in the Baltic states, civilians somewhere in a country in Africa, civilians somewhere in the Middle East, then this is how you should look to play the white cell. Have you seen any work that's being done in that sort of an area?
So there is some material publicly available, to my understanding, in I have seen discussion about playing non-military entities in resources like the Army Red Cell resources. I believe there's a NATO handbook that includes some discussion about green. That said, one of the challenges that was highlighted by the kind of conversations we had with folks is a difficulty of getting folks in the room, funding, personnel, knowledge, networking. When you have a J2 that's pulled in resources off the shelf to give them because it might be different from the kind of day job they're asked to do. And then making sure that they're modeling the civilians to a level that's relevant in the game. While it is important that if we were actually doing a conflict, thinking about the WASH requirements of this population is important. If this game is primarily about the electronics networks that are involved in talking with green folks, an in-depth vignette about sanitary conditions is not useful. And so finding out ways to either as a facilitator or a designer, get whoever's playing that role, let them know the kinds of things that are relevant, have thought through that beforehand, right? Like really thought through what are those second and first order effects, and then give effective tasking. So all of which to say a challenge that I hope we can collectively solve as a field.
I'm always in favor of capturing something for posterity with, you know, a written piece, a SOP or whatever it is. But I still, you know, we live in such a digitized age now that even bringing in someone remotely to reduce costs is still really very fruitful. And we've done it a few occasions. I think the one of the big problems is there's not a lot of actors who have experience, not just in understanding the impact on the civilian population, both in terms of immediate but second and third order effects, but also organizations that can translate that into parlay that is relevant and engaging and useful for military actors. And to this, I'm going to be very biased. I'm going to say that PAX and also, of course, Civic are two really important organizations that have both views. They can pull from the civilian perspective, but they're also able to translate that in a useful way. So anyone looking to, you know, put together a product like this, a war game that focuses on themes, reach out to them. I'm sure they'll be very happy to help out.
Yeah, on that point, specifically for the kinds of games that I do that are like US professional games, often they exist in spaces where most governments, most non-government folks don't have access because of clearance or access requirements, as well as, I think you had a great point, it's not just I need to understand the civilian environment, I need to understand how to convey that or think about that in the context of a military operation, and go back and forth, which is an even smaller group of folks, you know, maybe countable on a handful of, you know, fingers. So that can also be the challenge for there's kind of a niche requirement. So question here on kind of paramilitary forces, militias, or security companies. I think this is a different question if you're thinking about it from a hobby gaming perspective versus a professional military perspective. How it's modeled in the game is entirely dependent on the kind of game that we're looking to do, whether that's, you know, blocks or a player in the game or, you know, a friction. The kinds of games that we do tend not to the claims which there's paramilitaries, it's not so much a civilian game, but, you know, that being said, the gray zone question I think was brought up previously by Marco and others. So I'll turn it over to them for any thoughts.
I don't know who Marco was pointing at then.
I was just speaking.
In terms of what I'm seeing, obviously in the hobby games, you know, militia tends to just mean a strength 1 whereas against a strength 2 unit. But I have seen a couple of rules. In fact, I was just trying to dive and see if I can spot them. Where certainly for security companies, there were things like not necessarily morale rules, but in terms of the response of the security company to the situation was possibly less predictable than that of the regular troops. But it's not something I'm seeing a lot of.
The security thing actually made me think, I think it's coming out in 2027 from Ford Circle. I think it's Ford Circle. Dan Bullock's doing a game, Blood and Treasure. It's about security contractors during the, I believe it's the Afghan War, but during the global war on terror, playing through some of the perverse incentives that sometimes existed for resourcing and contracting. That's a hobby game. He's available on LinkedIn if you have any more questions on that. I was just at a historical wargaming convention in DC recently, and he was demoing some of that.
I think I alluded to this earlier when I said when we have our white team, depending on the scenario and the phase of the operation we're in, we have said sometimes, okay, you represent this politically or ethnically aligned group, and you instead align with this other group, so that when then white back briefs, they have different scenarios, which again underlines how the civilian population is not a uniform group. And one of the interesting ways this played out was also during a game that we did for NATO, where the commanders decided to evacuate an area that was probably going to be attacked, but some people did not decide to leave. And it was interesting how Blue tried to get their heads around why didn't they decide to leave? Was it just simply because they wanted to stay with their property, or because they weren't physically able, or because they didn't have anywhere to go? Or is there something else more malicious behind that intent? Also, because the small village that we had indicated was directly behind the defensive line that Blue had offered. So that made them have to think about various possibilities and trying again to understand the human environment. Who are we dealing with? Who's decided to stay? To better plan for their operations. So that's how we've played with that.
On the question or the comment about like civilians in the operational environment that you might not have expected, I think I think this is why I have, when I'm thinking about professional games, why I think the importance of including civilians as visible elements of the game is important for learning. Because there can be this kind of vision of a frictionless battle space because of what I have played through or seen before. And so making it visible when we're playing through kind of for training or education can kind of push back against this, that people will still look to fish during a maritime conflict because they need to eat, and you cannot, reasonably prevent them. That people are going to choose to stay, and that does not remove your burden of protection and due regard and proportionality and discretion and all of those things. And so I think there's this, particularly as you think about folks can have kind of this is anecdotal, but I'd say there can be a perception that like either it's World War II and we're doing all of the terrible things that happened before, which we aren't going to because we've made commitments and there's international, humanitarian human rights law and law of armed conflict, all that has come up to prevent it, or we're doing GWAT and helping us imagine the complexity through the learning from partners like the Ukrainians or learning from current operations, that it's not a frictionless battle space, and keeping that mentally relevant to players, I think, is a worthwhile training objective that I hope to see more games include.
And on that, Andrew, a question for both of you. An argument I've heard more than once is, okay, if a large-scale combat operation breaks out here in Europe, the people will understand because it's an existential fight and therefore just about anything goes, just like it did during David. This might speak to you, the Blitz and, World War II. And I've often tried to counter that by saying we are not the same society we were in the 1940s. And our degree of resilience, even across Europe, I feel varies significantly. So betting on that is not necessarily a winning tactic, but I'm curious to hear how you would all address a similar comment.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the UK, I mean, what surveys there have been suggest that there are, the number of British lads and lasses who would go out to the Baltic to go and defend the Baltic is probably very small. And they don't necessarily see the connectivity and the various knock-on effects, that sort of a combat might have. So I think you're right. It is a very, we've always been quite lucky. Obviously, we're an island, and that defensive mode has always worked quite well. But there was a war game done by Sky News last year looking at an attack on the UK, primarily an airborne attack in order to take out sort of key bits of infrastructure that showed just how vulnerable we are. And certainly in terms of looking at national resilience from both a climate point of view, from an economic point of view, and from a defence point of view, is something that probably should be higher up the agenda than it is at the moment.
I usually pivot those conversations back to the effectiveness question, to the, based on your goals, based on a desire for operational efficiency, and that it's going to end at the peacemaking table and people are going to have to live there afterwards, and all of those kind of things we talked about before, for the relevance of hitting the right things, understanding the consequences, keeping momentum, which you brought up, right? There were frustrations at times in the global war on terror when, because of a perceived increase in civilian harm or beyond kind of political capacity to bear, there'd be limits to operations. And so there'd be a challenges and restrictions. And so given all of these kind of purely military ends, and I would say kind of national ends of what are your goals here, this is a useful construct to employ, rather than say, oh, it's just going to be like this other conflict. Given that what you have told me you want to do, here is why mitigation of civilian harm. And it's not just, I'm not going to allow you to operate, it's we're going to build these infrastructures, we're going to, like all the training, right, can be useful as a way to flip the frame and kind of sidestep what can feel kind of like an infinite conversation about we don't actually know what the future is like ultimately. And if you're really going to tell me we're going to do the firebombing of Tokyo, is probably the end of this conversation. Thankfully, that almost never happens in the professional context I work with. It happens much more as when I present to the public and someone decides to be a little bit more edgy with me. But that is one way I try to respond to that question.
I'm sorry for monopolizing the questions here, but we will get to that one as well. But one thing that I think really, and I've been guilty of this as well, we very often call it time at the war game before we look at the transition. So we've just done a large-scale combat operation, or we've liberated a city. We don't talk about often, okay, Blue, how are you going to clean all this up? And again, I think this connects also back. So there's the physical component, which is unquestionably important, but also going back to what we said about moving into liberated areas. And it doesn't seem strategically relevant to worry about policing the streets, particularly if the conflict was ethnically generated. And so there's tensions within the urban area. There can also be tensions because people have left, others decided to stay. And now when those come back, they struggle to be accepted again because they're seen as the ones who abandoned the community in their moment of need. So there can be all sorts of post-conflict tension that can seriously jeopardize the peace building process. And this is not stuff that I know, this is stuff that PAX has taught me over the 5 years that I've worked with them, but we don't wargame this enough, at least we didn't. Have you had any experience in doing this?
In terms of again, the USEC model, so with City and SEMA, then at the end of the game, I switch to essentially discussion mode at the end of the game and take them through a phase of first of all, of consolidation, which is far more about how you're going to get ready to withstand the counterattack. But then into the discussion about transition. And what I found useful is to have, based on what's happened in the game, is to have a way of converting that just through some simple sort of rules of thumb into, numbers of casualties, numbers of civilians are going to be in the hospital, what the state of the building stock is like, how many, new homes, how many tents you need to provide, and then get a discussion going around the sort of short, medium and longer term transition aspects to it. If one had the time, then, essentially there's a whole new Matrix game that kicks off to war game the peace, back to what I was saying in terms of just war theory.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of ways that I've gone after. One of this is just the nature of analytic games are constrained by the research questions. And so often we are playing through a conflict not because I want to know ultimately how this conflict works, but how either a new piece of technology might integrate with it, different command structures might perform better or worse, what are our gaps and seams. There's a great article by my colleague Jeremy Sapinski called Wargaming Taiwan, Why Winning is Losing. And it's about kind of the way that we design games often define failure modes. And so it's not inherently a faulty design to only do that at initial portion of conflict or only do a specific series of vignettes or scenarios. There can be loss in learning, particularly if the way we approached it, right, had caused harm that we didn't capture or didn't discuss. And so I think that's really on the data collectors and the design. But what can be useful and what's really interesting about wargaming is to ask folks at the end, do you think you're winning, right? Like, do you think you're ahead? Have you met your objectives? And I think this is particularly interesting when I support professional military education around DC. They're maybe playing through a conflict in which they would both say, no, I'm good. Like I'm ahead, I'm executing on plan, which can speak to the kind of that empathy question, and which can go back to the civilian harm one of know, you mentioned We Are Coming Nineveh, right? There's a narrative win in that game where I have lost all of my forces, but I have won the narrative, and that's what I wanted to do. You have looked like a monster in destroying the city, and so this met other objectives. And so asking folks to think about the next steps, if it's that kind of game, right? If there's a great quote by Dan that I really enjoyed, which was, war games without politics are just the aspirational usage of equipment. And that's okay. Sometimes we are doing a game about the aspirational use of equipment because we are trying to figure out what to buy and why to buy it. But when you're at a game at a higher level, then it is the really important time to ask the folks to think about the kind of follow-on, the strategic, as part of that plenary or the hot wash, the matrix game, the data collection of otherwise.
Yeah, well, just to come to that question about publicly available games out there. Yes, there will definitely be at least 6 more. Because I've done 6 games as part of the PhD, and my intention is to get all of them out, either onto Tabletop Simulator or Print and Play. Urban Calculus and Rubble Town are both already out on both the Print and Play and TTS, and hopefully Ruckus and Brick by Bloody Brick will follow over the next couple of months, and then finally City and Seema and OPUC, which are the 2 most beefy of the games. But yeah, certainly I'm trying to do my bit. In terms of some of the other games that are due, I hope we will see more coverage of it. Obviously, for hobby games, there's not a particular incentive, and if anything, there's a disincentive to include some of these aspects in the game. There's meant to be a game coming out on Sadr City, so it'll be interesting to see what that includes in it for this side of things.
From the professional side, we've already highlighted a bunch of hobby games. I think David's work probably also highlights, Aftershock or We Are Coming Nineveh. There's from the Institute for Defense Analysis. I'm not sure if it's still as part of the post, but one of their analysts designed a small postcard kind of mini game on taking a city and civilian harm. I'm fingers crossed. We're going to try to get the game packet for the Losco game released. That is more of a TTX and meant for a training audience, but that'll be another resource. I hope it's more. I would say the gaming world as a whole, particularly the hobby gaming world, is developing its maturity about how it thinks about complex subjects. And so many folks in this panel and watching this may be familiar with the work of Carl Worley, who's done a lot of great work on empire and thinking about how we characterize perspective. And so I think there's a push to think more about this, and I'm optimistic. But like others have mentioned, it gets in the way of kind of the fun power fantasy part of wargaming. And so I think it's hopeful as we get more diverse perspectives in wargames, as we have games like Cross Bronx Expressway about the destruction of communities because of infrastructure projects, that we see more games with seeing this as the default assumption that, of course, there is harm and conflict, rather than this kind of bolt-on thing we have when we feel particularly moral.
Yeah, and with the mention of postcard games, what we are seeing is an increased number of micro games coming out, and those are ideal for exploring some of these topics. I think Violent Victory is one that came out from Georgetown University, and that is very much about managing of civilian harm, managing of displaced persons, and that sort of side of things. And that's a print and play game.
I think that brings us almost to time. Unless there are any save rounds out there in the online audience, if there are any closing remarks that you gents want to make. We got one. The Blood and Treasure games focus sound particularly interesting in light of the recent French trial verdict in the Lafarge case and possible implications for decision-making in the private sector. I am not familiar with the case. I don't know if either of you are. Then, gents, David, because you're high and left to my screen, I'll give you the honor of starting with any closing comments, and over to you, Andrew, and I'll see.
I think that as we've all said, this is an important aspect that certainly in professional wargaming needs to be addressed, and I think it's also important that we have ways of addressing it in smaller games as well as the bigger multiplayer, umpiring games. So that's the thing that's particularly of interest to me is basically the boxed game, but aimed at a professional audience. That can spread the word out beyond those sort of large scale games run by the consultancies and the bigger players. So the more we can do across all levels to include these issues in these games, I think it's got to be for the good.
Yeah, I would add similarly. I think it's been really encouraging since I've started participating in this area in the last 2 years to see more discussion, particularly in wargaming. The work we did to bring the folks together from the workshop. One of the takeaways for me was just all the folks kind of doing the finger point, be like, oh, you are also interested in this. You also see its relevancy, whether they were at National Defense University or they were at Stratcom, or they were at FFRDC's federally funded research centers like CNA or RAND or other places. And so I think that's really encouraging. And it's encouraging because I think I firmly believe this isn't a nice to have extra kind of moral icing on the cake. It's about being games that show robust, plausible, and useful depictions of reality. And part of that reality of conflict is civilian harm. And then we need to take it seriously as part of our elements of professional gaming.
I am not pessimistic. I want to be optimistic that the momentum that we've created in the last 5 or so years will slowly return to many of the key stakeholders in this. As I said, I'm very much encouraged by what I'm seeing from other countries, but also so proud to see the hard work of organizations, particularly, again, PACs that have worked with the Iraqi government that have made giant steps forward in their national POC policy, and others that are following suit. So I want to think that internationally, there's still a lot of interest in this, and I'm equally convinced today that this is a key component to ensuring strategic victory and not just winning all the battles, but essentially losing the war. So I hope that this trend will pick up again, and that we'll be back where we were not too long ago, and that the military and other security actors and other stakeholders will continue to do great things and wargame these themes, particularly in a comprehensive manner. It'd be great to also see other stakeholders, including the political level, engaged in this, working alongside the military and non-military actors in trying to mitigate harm. My thanks to both of you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me and having us, and particularly for having this session, which I really think is so relevant, particularly at this juncture. I'd like to thank Jan Heinemann as well, who was the one who particularly reached out to me. I'm not sure about the rest of you. I really thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thank you.
And thank you to all those who are out there participating and listening to us.